The clock on the dashboard of Ben Carter's truck read 2:42 p.m., and every second after that became a countdown to a different life. He didn't know it yet. That was the cruelest part of what was about to unfold, the fact that he was still driving toward his future with the weight of the past 3 years pressing down on his shoulders like an anchor. The truck itself was a testament to those years. The paint had faded from blue to something closer to gray, and the air conditioning hadn't worked since February. Now it was October, which meant the oppressive heat had finally broken, but the phantom of sweat still seemed to cling to the steering wheel. His fingers were white-knuckled against the leather as he navigated the afternoon traffic on Route 12, taking the back roads to avoid the worst of the gridlock. He'd done the math 100 times. 23 minutes from his current location to the Meridian Hotel's corporate office downtown. 17 minutes of that buffer time sat in his pocket like a prayer he didn't quite believe in anymore. The interview was scheduled for 3 o'clock, a single opportunity that had taken him 3 months to arrange. His previous attempts at employment had all collapsed under the weight of bad timing and worse luck. There was the warehouse position he'd lost when his truck broke down and he couldn't make the early shifts for 2 weeks running. The construction contract that evaporated when the company ran out of funding mid-project. The steady HVAC work that had kept them afloat for 2 years until his knees started to give out, making the crawl spaces under houses into chambers of pain that radiated up his spine. Each failure had been its own small apocalypse. Each one had taught him something new about desperation and the particular shame of a man in his mid-30s who couldn't seem to catch a break. But this interview at Meridian Hotels was supposed to be different. The position was facilities manager for their main downtown property, steady work benefits, that actually meant something, a salary that would let Lily sleep in a room that wasn't right next to his, a salary that would mean he didn't have to choose between new shoes for her and paying the electric bill. He'd prepared meticulously. The night before, he'd ironed the same 3 shirts he rotated for formal occasions, choosing the one without the small stain near the collar. He'd even paid for a professional haircut, trimming away the longer pieces that made him look like someone who'd given up on the details of life. His resume had been revised and revised again, each version adding a small embellishment that wasn't quite a lie, but wasn't quite truth either. 8 years of HVAC work became comprehensive mechanical systems expertise. The contract gigs were reframed as multiple successful independent projects. The gaps in employment were condensed and minimized, pushed into the margins where they might not be noticed. He'd watched videos on how to answer interview questions, how to sit in a chair in a way that projected confidence even when your hands wanted to shake. He'd even practiced in the mirror, saying his qualifications aloud until the words felt less foreign in his mouth. The reason it mattered this much was waiting at home in their small apartment. Lily was 7 years old, and she had begun to understand what the silences meant. Not the quiet moments between them, which were often full of a kind of companionable peace, but the other silences, the ones where Ben would stare at the pile of bills on the kitchen table without really seeing them. His mind turned inward toward calculations of impossible choices. She'd stopped asking for birthday presents 3 years ago, around the time she'd started noticing the looks on his face when she mentioned things her friends had. Her classroom was filled with children whose mothers worked in offices and whose fathers drove cars that didn't rattle when they accelerated. Lily had internalized the lesson of their difference early, absorbing it through 1,000 small moments that added up to a fundamental understanding of scarcity. She didn't complain. That was the thing that gutted him most. She simply made herself smaller, her needs more compact, as if she could fold herself down into something that took up less space in the world. Ben had been doing that same folding his entire adult life. The marriage that had dissolved when his ex-wife decided that single motherhood and poverty were equally unappealing propositions, so she might as well cut her losses. The dreams of starting his own business, which had been sacrificed first for the marriage and then for the simple need to keep the lights on. The belief that hard work would automatically translate into security, a conviction that had been worn down by years of evidence to the contrary. What remained was a kind of stubborn determination that had calcified into something harder and colder. He would provide for his daughter. That was the iron core of everything. He would not let her down the way the world had let him down. He would not let her feel the particular shame of poverty that he felt every single day, the shame of rationing electricity, of buying clothes at secondhand stores, of pretending that the free school lunch program was something they simply preferred rather than something they desperately needed. The Meridian interview was supposed to change that equation. He'd done everything right. He'd shown up early for the preliminary phone screening. He'd answered the technical questions about HVAC systems with the kind of casual expertise that only came from years of hands-on work. He'd spoken about his experience with problem solving and his ability to manage both mechanical systems and the workers who maintain them. He'd projected reliability and competence and a quiet professionalism that the recruiter had seemed to appreciate. 2 weeks ago, she'd called back with the date and time. "They're very interested in your background," she'd said, and Ben had felt something in his chest expand with a cautious kind of hope, a hope that felt dangerous even as he harbored it. The afternoon sun was angled across Route 12 in a way that made the road shimmer with heat distortion. It had been 93 degrees when he'd left the apartment that morning, and the weather had only worsened as the day progressed. Traffic was moderate for this time of day, the late afternoon commute not yet in full swing. Ben kept his speed steady, maintaining a careful distance from the vehicles in front of him. He'd spent enough time on these roads to know where the cops usually sat, where the light synchronization favored faster driving, where an accident was most likely to form. Route 12 was the kind of road that looked innocuous but had a body count. Too many people trying to make up time, too many distracted drivers, too many moments where split-second judgment failed and physics took over. At 2:44 p.m., the sedan four vehicles ahead of him began to weave. It was subtle at first, just a slight rightward drift that might have been a lane change. But then it overcorrected, swinging hard back to the left. Ben could see the brake lights flare crimson. The sedan's tires caught the edge of the shoulder, and the entire vehicle seemed to lift for a moment, suspended in that terrible pause before gravity reasserted itself. The driver yanked the wheel back toward the road, but the car was already committed to its trajectory. It fishtailed across both lanes of traffic with a kind of terrible grace, and Ben's foot found the brake with an instinct that was older than conscious thought. The sedan ahead of him swerved to avoid the sliding car. The one behind him did the same, but the sedan itself continued on its arc, and then it hit the utility pole that stood sentinel at the edge of the road with an impact that seemed to happen in slow motion and instantaneously at the same time. The sound was extraordinary. It was the sound of metal reforming itself against immovable objects, the sound of glass shattering in 1,000 different frequencies, simultaneously, the sound of something alive and complex being reduced to twisted wreckage in the space of a heartbeat. The utility pole shuddered but held. The sedan did not hold anything at all. Its front end crumpled like a piece of discarded paper. Steam or smoke or something in between began to rise from the engine compartment. The smell hit Ben a moment later, gasoline and hot metal, and the sharp chemical signature of a car dying hard. He was already pulling to the shoulder, already shifting into park. His hands moved with a kind of automatic certainty that bypassed his thinking brain entirely. 23 minutes to the interview. 17 minutes to make it if he turned this truck around right now and drove like his life depended on it. That calculation registered somewhere in the back of his mind, even as every other part of him was already moving toward the wreckage. Around him, other vehicles were pulling over. But the people who got out were doing what people do after accidents. They were raising their phones, capturing the moment, backing away from the danger to a safe distance where they could witness without participating. Ben could see at least 40 people doing this, their faces illuminated by screen light, their expressions a mixture of shock and fascination, and something he didn't want to examine too closely about the human appetite for disaster. No one moved toward the sedan. No one ran toward the smoke the way you see in movies. No one seemed to register that there was a person inside that crumpled metal, a person whose life might depend on what happened in the next few seconds. The driver's side window was cracked in a way that created a spiderweb pattern of fracture lines radiating from a central point of impact. Through that spiderweb, Ben could see movement. A woman slumped against the steering wheel, her head tilted at an angle that made his stomach clench. Blood streaked down the side of her face from a gash along her temple. Her eyes were moving, searching. Her lips were moving, too, forming words that he couldn't hear through the glass, in the distance, and the fact that his blood was roaring in his ears like a river. "Help me." 2 words, not even really a complete voice, more the shape of desperation given form. And then her head turned just slightly enough that he could see her eyes widen with a new urgency, and he understood that she'd seen something he hadn't yet perceived. Behind her in the back seat, a small hand was pressed against the rear window. A child's hand. Small fingers splayed against the glass, as if the child could push their way towards safety through sheer force of will. 2:46 p.m. 14 minutes until the interview time, and Ben was already running toward the wreckage. His legs carried him across the shoulder of the road in a movement that felt both urgent and dreamlike. The gasoline smell grew stronger, with every step acrid and overwhelming, a warning that his body recognized even if his conscious mind was refusing to process the danger. The utility pole had created a shadow across the sedan, a small mercy of geometry. The engine was still smoking, thin wisps curling up from the hood. The door handle was hot when Ben grabbed it. Hot enough that his hand jerked back involuntarily, but he forced it to curl around the metal again, pulled with all of his strength. The door was wedged, crushed against the frame by the weight of the impact. He pulled harder, feeling the muscles in his shoulder burn with the effort, and the door gave way with a groan of protesting metal. The woman looked up at him when he wrenched the door open. Her eyes were unfocused, glassy with shock, but they found him and locked on with the intensity of someone clinging to the last solid thing in a disintegrating world. Her mouth kept making that same shape over and over. Help me, help me, help me. But no sound came out anymore, just the movement of her lips, the desperation rendered in pure gesture. Ben reached into the car and his hand came away slick with blood before he'd even touched her. There was a gash on her forehead that he hadn't seen from outside, a deep cut that bled freely, soaking into her hair and running down the side of her face. She was still wearing a seatbelt, the nylon strap locked tight across her chest, pinning her against the seat. "I've got you," Ben said. He wasn't sure if it was true. Wasn't sure of anything except that the smell of gasoline was getting stronger, and somewhere behind him, someone was shouting. A man's voice. "Everyone back, get back. That thing's going to blow." But Ben wasn't getting back. His fingers found the buckle of the seatbelt, fumbled with the release mechanism. The first try didn't work. The second try didn't work either. On the third try, the belt released with a sharp click, and the woman's body sagged toward him like a puppet with cut strings. He got his arm around her shoulder, supporting her weight as she tried to stand on legs that weren't cooperating properly. Her hands grabbed his shirt, fingers twisted in the fabric with surprising strength, and she turned her head with a desperate urgency that transcended any pain she might have been feeling. The little girl in the back seat. That was what the gesture said. That was what the twist of her body meant. Ben followed her gaze without needing words to translate. The little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. She was strapped into a booster seat, her small body held in place by nylon and plastic, her head tilted at an angle that suggested she was unconscious. A trickle of blood ran from her nose. Her eyes were closed. She wasn't moving. The sight of her made something in Ben's chest drop like a stone into deep water. He eased the woman down onto the pavement, her protest muffled and weak, her hands still reaching toward him even as he pulled away. The gasoline smell was overwhelming now. He could taste it in his mouth, acrid and chemical. But the little girl was still in the car. That was the only fact that mattered anymore. He dove back into the sedan. The back seat was a minefield of destruction. Shattered glass covered every surface. A piece of twisted metal from the door frame had folded inward, creating a jagged obstacle course. The booster seat was wedged at an angle that made reaching the buckle nearly impossible. Ben's fingers found the clasp and fumbled with it. The plastic was hot from the friction of the impact. His fingers slipped off the first time, slipped off the second time. On the third attempt, the mechanism gave way with a click, and the little girl slumped forward into his arms. She was warm. That was the detail that registered first. She was warm and breathing, and Ben felt something in his chest that had been clenched since he first saw her loosened by a fraction of a degree. He carried her out of the sedan and laid her gently beside her mother on the pavement. The woman was sobbing now, real sounds finally breaking through the shock, her voice ragged and desperate. She pulled her daughter close with shaking hands, and the little girl's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Mommy," she said in a voice so small it made something in Ben's chest crack wide open. The crowd had pressed closer. The phones were still raised, still recording. Someone said the ambulance was coming. Just a few more minutes. Hang in there. Ben stood there with his chest heaving, looking down at the woman and the child. The woman reached out and caught his hand, squeezed it hard enough to hurt. Thank you, she whispered. Her voice was wrecked barely above a whisper. Thank you, thank you. I thought nobody. She couldn't finish the sentence, just held onto his hand like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Ben squeezed back once before he gently pulled free. He looked at his watch. 2:51 p.m. 9 minutes until the interview that would have changed everything. 9 minutes to get back to his truck. Another 23 minutes to drive downtown. If he pushed the speed limit hard enough, if the lights cooperated, if everything aligned in his favor. He could still make it. He could still walk into that conference room with his resume in hand and a best smile plastered across his face. He could still pretend that his hands weren't shaking from adrenaline and gasoline fumes, and the residual impact of human mortality made manifest in twisted metal. But the woman was still holding his hand, and her eyes were still locked on his face with an intensity that suggested she was seeing not just a man who had helped her, but a man who had made a choice to help her instead of something else, instead of somewhere else, instead of someone else. The calculation was there in her expression, the understanding that his hands had stunk of gasoline when they pulled her daughter from the car. The knowledge that he had given up something crucial in those moments when he was pulling on seatbelts and fumbling with buckles instead of sitting in traffic, checking his watch every few seconds, mentally preparing himself for the most important interview of his life. Take care of her, he said, nodding at the little girl. And then he was running back to his truck. His shoes crunched over broken glass scattered across the asphalt. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might break through. He threw himself into the driver's seat and pulled back onto the road, weaving through the stopped traffic with a kind of reckless urgency that was probably dangerous. The clock on the dashboard ticked forward as he drove. 2:53, 2:55, 2:58. He made it through a yellow light that was turning red, cut across 2 lanes of traffic that was moving too slowly. The city downtown loomed larger in front of him as he pushed the truck towards 70, then 75, then 78 on a road marked 45. There were other vehicles in his way, drivers who weren't cooperating with his timeline, people who didn't understand that everything depended on the next few seconds. By the time he screeched into the parking lot of Meridian Hotels, the clock read 3:28 p.m., 28 minutes late, nearly half an hour past the time he was supposed to present himself as a man who valued punctuality and reliability and the kind of professional standards that corporations depended on. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, engine still running, staring at the gleaming glass tower in front of him. It was a new building, maybe 3 years old, all chrome and tinted glass, and the kind of architectural confidence that came from spending obscene amounts of money on the design. The kind of building that was meant to communicate success and stability, and the kind of institutional power that could crush a person like him without even noticing. He just knew with a certainty that transcended hope or optimism that he was too late. The lobby was all marble and gold fixtures, the kind of place that made Ben acutely aware of every aspect of his appearance. The grease stain on his work jacket from an HVAC job he'd done yesterday, the visible dirt under his fingernails that he'd tried to scrub away but hadn't quite managed, the scuff marks on his boots from the accident site. The smell of gasoline still clung to his clothes. He could smell it on himself. He could smell the metallic undertone of blood too, though whether that was real or his imagination he couldn't say. The receptionist looked up from her desk as he approached, and her expression shifted almost immediately from the professional politeness she'd probably given him at the beginning of the afternoon to something cooler, more dismissive. She took in the visual data of him at a glance. The disheveled hair, the desperate look in his eyes, the way his clothes hung on him like they belonged to a man who was slowly disappearing. "I'm here for the 300 interview," Ben said, trying to keep his voice level, trying to project some semblance of the competence and reliability he'd practiced in the mirror. "I know I'm late. There was an accident, a car accident. I had to stop to help someone. I can explain." He was breathing hard from the run from the parking lot. He was trying to control the adrenaline that was still flooding his system. He was trying to be professional and credible in the face of evidence that suggested neither quality was in evidence. The receptionist's smile didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile that was offered to people who were already categorized and filed away. "Your interview slot was at 300 p.m., Mr. Carter. It is now 3:28. I'm afraid the position has been filled." She said it with the kind of finality that suggested the conversation was already over, that any further protest would simply be met with the same polite firmness. "I understand I'm late," Ben said, and he heard the desperation in his own voice, hated himself for the way he sounded like a man who was already defeated, already accepting the inevitable conclusion. "But if I could just speak to someone for a few minutes. I was in an accident, a car accident. There was a child involved. I had to help." He was aware even as he said it that he sounded insane, that he sounded like a man making excuses, which he was, that he sounded like someone who couldn't manage his own time effectively, which was the last thing someone in his position could afford to sound like. "Do you have documentation?" the receptionist asked. "A police report, hospital records, something official." There was no sympathy in her voice, just the flat efficiency of someone following a script. "Because Mr. Carter Maritson Hotels values punctuality and reliability above all else. We received over 200 applications for this position. The candidate who showed up on time demonstrated those values. The one who didn't did not. I'm sorry, but there's nothing more I can do for you." Ben wanted to argue, wanted to explain about the woman with blood on her face, about the little girl who'd said "mommy" in that tiny broken voice. Wanted to make this woman understand that there were things that mattered more than being on time to an interview. But he could see in her eyes that it wouldn't matter, that she'd already made up her mind, had already filed him away under unreliable, and moved on to the next name on her list. Her gaze had already returned to her computer screen, her attention already redirected to whatever task she'd been doing before he'd walked in. He was erased. So Ben just nodded and turned around and walked back out into the afternoon sun, which seemed too bright now, too cheerful for the way his chest felt hollow and scraped out. The lobby doors slid open automatically, responding to his proximity with an efficiency that mocked him somehow. The outdoor air hit him like a physical thing, hot and thick with humidity. He could still smell the gasoline on his clothes. He could still taste it in his mouth. He sat in his truck for a long time, not starting the engine, just staring through the windshield at the parking lot. The sun was lower now, beginning its descent toward evening. The asphalt in front of him shimmered with heat distortion. People were walking across the lot. People who had appointments kept and interviews secured and futures that didn't depend on the kindness of women in car accidents. He didn't feel angry yet. The anger would come later. Right now, he just felt empty, like something essential had been scooped out of his chest and replaced with a kind of hollow shock. He pulled out his phone and called the after-school program where Lily spent her afternoons. The director answered on the second ring. Ben told her he'd be picking up Lily soon, that he was running a bit late, but would be there within the hour. There was a kind of routine politeness to the exchange. He paid them on time always, even when it meant cutting other corners. It was his responsibility. It was the one thing he'd managed to protect from the general chaos of his life. When Lily got in the truck, she was still wearing her school uniform, still carrying her backpack. She climbed into the passenger seat and immediately looked at his face with the kind of intuition that children sometimes possessed. "Did you get the job?" she asked. Her voice was bright and eager still, carrying the hope that adults had mostly trained out of her, but which still surfaced in moments when she allowed herself to believe that good things might happen. "Not today, sweetheart," Ben said. "Maybe next time." He was aware, even as he said it, that there might not be a next time. That next time implied opportunity and possibility and the belief that the universe might be negotiable. He pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward home, not bothering to suggest ice cream this time. The budget for ice cream had already been eliminated 3 weeks ago. The next 2 weeks moved like something thick and suffocating. The calendar pages turned, but time itself seemed to slow, compressed by the weight of Ben's awareness that something crucial had shifted. He'd picked up whatever HVAC repair jobs he could find, mostly residential work that paid by the hour, and dried up as autumn settled in and people stopped worrying about their air conditioning systems failing in the heat. He fixed a furnace for an elderly couple who paid him in cash and insisted on giving him homemade cookies, which he accepted with a graciousness that cost him more than the money. He replaced a compressor for a landlord who tried to short him $20 and acted like he was doing Ben a favor by hiring him at all. Ben didn't fight the man, just accepted the reduced payment and added it to the mental ledger of small humiliations that comprised his daily existence. He drove all over the city in his battered truck tools, rattling in the back, and tried not to think about the number in his bank account that kept creeping lower and lower despite how hard he worked. The credit cards were already maxed out. The rent was due in 10 days. The electric bill had come with a red warning stamp that said, "Final notice," in letters designed to convey urgency and the possibility of imminent disconnection. He had perhaps another month before the math simply stopped working, before the accumulated debt exceeded his ability to service it, before they stopped being able to afford even the bare minimum of housing and utilities that kept their lives functional. Lily noticed. Kids always did, even when you tried to hide it with everything you had. She stopped asking for things. She didn't ask for new shoes when her sneakers got too tight at the toe. She didn't ask for art supplies for the school project that required them, just told her teacher that she'd forgotten to get them, a lie that Ben suspected everyone involved understood, but pretended to believe anyway. She didn't ask for the book series that all her friends were reading, the one that was apparently amazing and that everyone in her class was talking about. Instead, she started offering to share her lunch with Ben, picking at her sandwich with studied casualness, and saying she wasn't really that hungry anyway. She drank less milk at dinner. She stopped asking if there would be snacks after school. She began to understand somehow that there was a connection between her needs and the look that crossed her father's face when she expressed them, and she made the natural choice to express fewer of them. It made Ben want to put his fist through a wall. It made him want to scream. It made him want to go back to that afternoon 2 weeks ago and make different choices, grab the interview opportunity with both hands instead of letting it slip away because of a woman whose name he didn't even know. He'd saved their lives. He'd pulled them from a burning car with gasoline fumes choking the air and the possibility of explosion hanging over everything. He'd done the right thing, and the right thing had cost him everything. One night, Ben was sorting through the mail bills, mostly all of them stamped with red warnings about past due amounts or late fees or the imminent consequence of non-payment. He was trying to figure out the calculus of what could be paid this month and what would have to go unpaid, what companies would tolerate delay, and which ones would move toward disconnection or collection action. The math was impossible. There was never enough to cover everything. He would have to make choices, prioritize, and watch the consequences of those choices accumulate. The landlord definitely had to be paid. The electric bill probably, unless he wanted to spend the winter in darkness and cold. The water bill might be delayable for another month. The credit cards would just charge more interest, but at least they wouldn't disconnect the service in quite the same immediate way. Lily came and sat next to him at the kitchen table, still wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones with the stars that were getting too short in the sleeves. She had her math homework spread out in front of her, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at Ben with an expression that was too old, too knowing for a 7-year-old child. Something had shifted in her in these past 2 weeks. Something about watching her father navigate the impossible mathematics of poverty had accelerated her understanding of the world in a way that childhood usually protected against. "Dad," she said quietly, "are we going to be okay?" The question hung in the air between them, and Ben felt something in his chest clenched tight like a fist. He put down the electric bill he'd been staring at without really seeing, and pulled Lily into his lap, even though she was getting too big for it, even though his back protested after a day spent crawling around in crawl spaces, in tight mechanical spaces where his body was folded against itself. "Yeah, baby," he said into her hair, which smelled like the cheap shampoo they bought in bulk from the discount store. "We're going to be okay, I promise." It was the kind of promise you made even when you weren't sure you could keep it. It was the kind of promise that parents had been making since the beginning of time, a kind of hopeful lie that was the only thing standing between a child and the full weight of understanding their own precarious circumstances. Lily nodded against his chest, and he held her until her breathing evened out, and she'd almost fallen asleep, her small body relaxing against his, in the way that only tired children could do. Then he carried her to bed and tucked her in under the thin blankets that would need to be supplemented by quilts when the temperature dropped. He stood in the doorway for a long time watching her sleep, watching the rise and fall of her chest, trying to figure out how he was going to pay rent next month. The answer didn't come that night. It didn't come the next day either. The answer came 3 days later in the form of a phone call from a number Ben didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Too many creditors calling lately. Too many conversations that started with artificial politeness and ended with thinly veiled threats. The kind of calls that brought anxiety with them that made his stomach clench before he even heard the voice on the other end. But something made him pick up on the fourth ring. Some small voice that suggested that ignoring the problem would only make it worse. "Hello," he said. His voice was cautious, guarded. "Is this Ben Carter?" A woman's voice came through the phone. It was hesitant, slightly rough around the edges, like she wasn't entirely sure she was doing the right thing in making this call. "The man who helped at the accident on Route 12 2 weeks ago." Ben's hand tightened on the phone. "Yeah, that's me." He couldn't imagine what this could be about. Lawsuits, maybe. Something official. Something that it would add another layer of complication to an already impossible situation. "Who is this?" "Oh, thank God," the woman said, and the relief in her voice was genuine and palpable, a real thing that you could almost touch through the phone line. "I've been trying to find you. The police wouldn't give me your information, privacy laws or whatever. But I got the traffic camera footage and tracked down your license plate through the registration. And I'm sorry, I know this sounds creepy. I just really needed to thank you properly. You saved our lives." "If you hadn't stopped, if you hadn't pulled us out of that car," the paramedic said. She trailed off, and Ben could hear the effort it took her to compose herself. "I don't need any thanks," Ben said, though the words came out automatically, something he'd been trained to say by a lifetime of small interactions. "I'm just glad you're both okay. Your daughter, is she?" He couldn't even finish the question. He'd been trying not to think about the little girl, trying not to imagine what might have happened if he'd made a different choice that afternoon. "Harper," the woman said. "Her name's Harper, and she's fine, completely fine thanks to you. Concussion and some bruising, but the doctor said if she'd been in that car any longer, if the smoke had gotten worse." Her voice cracked, went quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, it was steadier, more controlled, like she was drawing on some reservoir of composure that she kept for moments like this. "My name is Rachel, Rachel Hayes. And I know this is probably strange, but I'd really like to meet you in person to thank you and to ask you something that I think might matter." They met 2 days later at a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and an aesthetic that suggested artisanal coffee and the kind of prices that reflected both the quality and the location. Ben got there early, ordered a black coffee he didn't really want, just to have something in his hands, and sat at a table by the window watching people pass by on the sidewalk outside. He was nervous in a way he couldn't quite explain. The woman Rachel had been kind on the phone. Her voice had suggested gratitude and something like respect. But he'd learned over the years that people's true motivations often revealed themselves to be more complicated than their words suggested. He tried to prepare himself for whatever this was, but found that there was no real way to prepare. He was just going to have to experience it and respond. When Rachel walked in, he almost didn't recognize her. The woman from the accident had been covered in blood and tears and broken glass and shock. Her appearance scrambled by the chaos of the moment. This woman was put together in a way that spoke of money and power, and the kind of access to resources that transformed a person's presentation of self. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Her clothes were expensive, but understated the kind of outfit that probably cost more than Ben made in a month, but was designed not to announce that fact. She moved with a kind of confidence that came from never having had to worry about the cost of anything. But when she spotted him, her face softened into something grateful and overwhelmed, and Ben recognized in that expression the echo of the woman from the accident. "Ben," she said, sliding into the chair across from him, "thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me again." She smiled, and it was a genuine expression of warmth, not the practiced smile of someone conducting business. "I know this is weird. 2 weeks ago, I didn't know your name, and now I'm tracking down your license plate and calling you on the phone. But I needed to do this in person." "You said you wanted to ask me something," Ben said. He was aware that he sounded direct to the point of rudeness, but he didn't know how to do small talk in a situation like this. He didn't know what the appropriate social script was for meeting the people you'd pulled from a car accident and talking to them in a coffee shop weeks later. "On the phone." Rachel smiled at his directness like she appreciated the absence of pretense. "I did," she said, "but first I need to properly thank you for what you did. The doctor said another 2 minutes and the smoke inhalation would have—" She stopped, shook her head. "You risked your life for strangers, and I need you to know that means something. It meant everything." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Ben said. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the weight of her gratitude, the way it seemed to be pressing down on him with more intensity than he could comfortably bear. No, Rachel said firmly. They wouldn't have. There were 40 people standing there with their phones out recording and not one of them moved. Just you. Just you risked your life and your safety to pull my daughter out of a burning car. She paused, studying his face with an intensity that made him look away. You look tired. It's been a long couple of weeks, Ben said, because of the interview you missed. It wasn't your fault, Ben said, and he heard the defensiveness in his own voice, the shame. The sense that he should have made a different choice somehow, should have found a way to do both things at once, save the woman and her daughter, and still make it to the interview on time. As if the universe operated according to principles that would have allowed such a thing. It's not yours either, Rachel said quietly, but it happened anyway. And now you're struggling because you chose to do the right thing. And that's, she made a frustrated gesture like she was trying to catch hold of the right words, trying to shape the air into language that could convey her meaning. That's not okay. I looked you up, Ben. I did some research. I found out you were supposed to interview for a position at Meridian Hotels that day, and that you didn't get it because you were late, because you stopped to help us. Ben felt his jaw tighten. That's not your responsibility. You didn't make me stop. I chose to. No one put a gun to my head. No, Rachel acknowledged. You chose to do the right thing, and it cost you something crucial. And I want to help make that right. I want to help. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that looked like determination. Ben, what if I told you that you could still get that job? What if I told you that I could make one phone call and get you another interview, an even better one? Ben frowned. He was struggling to understand the mechanics of how such a thing would be possible. How would you do that? He asked, and he could hear the suspicion in his own voice, couldn't quite help it. In his experience, people like Rachel Hayes, people with money and power and connections, didn't just hand out favors to guys like him. There was always a catch, always an angle, always something hidden in the fine print and that you didn't discover until it was too late to change course. Rachel's smile was self-deprecating wry. Because my father owns the company that owns Meridian Hotels Hayes Property Group. We're the majority stakeholder. She said it casually like she was mentioning the weather, but the words seemed to shift something fundamental in the air between them. The coffee shop seemed to go very quiet. Or maybe it was just that Ben's ears were ringing his brain, trying to process what Rachel had just said. The woman he'd pulled from a burning car, the woman whose daughter he'd carried to safety while gas fumes choked the air around them, was the daughter of Richard Hayes, the Richard Hayes whose face was on the business section of the newspaper half the time, whose real estate empire stretched across 6 states, whose name was synonymous with success and wealth, and the kind of power that could reshape the landscape of entire cities. Ben started then stopped because he didn't have language for what she was. That's a lot, he finally managed. I know, Rachel said, and her expression was still wry, still self-aware. I don't usually lead with that information. Kinda kills the getting to know you process when people find out your dad could buy and sell them twice over before breakfast. But in this case, it means I can help. My father respects my judgment. If I tell him you deserve another shot at that interview, he'll make it happen. I promise you that. Ben wanted to ask why, wanted to express the suspicion that seemed obvious to him, the sense that there was an angle here, something he wasn't understanding about the transaction that was being offered. But Rachel spoke before he could formulate the question. Because Harper asked about you, she said. She wanted to know if the nice man who saved us was okay if he had kids of his own, if we could do something to say thank you. And when I found out what happened, what you lost by helping us, She paused, choosing her words carefully like she was building something delicate that might shatter if she wasn't precise. I realized I had a chance to show my daughter that good things can happen to good people. That doing the right thing doesn't always mean getting punished for it. So yes, I'm doing this partly for you, but I'm also doing it for her. To prove that the world isn't quite as awful as it sometimes seems. Ben wanted to argue, wanted to say he didn't need anyone's help, that he'd figure it out on his own like he always did, that accepting charity would somehow diminish him in a way that he couldn't accept. But he thought about Lily and her 2 small pajamas, about the electric bill with its final notice stamp, about the way she'd asked if they were going to be okay. And he'd promised yes, even though he wasn't sure. Sometimes pride was a luxury you couldn't afford, and this was apparently one of those moments. Sometimes you had to swallow the shame of being helped in order to survive long enough to help yourself. Okay, he said quietly. If you can do that, if it's not too much trouble, then yeah. Okay, thank you. Rachel's smile was genuine warm, the smile of someone who'd gotten the answer she was hoping for. Don't thank me yet, she said. You still have to nail the interview. 3 days later, Ben got a call from Meridian Hotels. Not the cold receptionist from before, but someone from Human Resources. Someone who spoke in professional tones and explained that they'd had a position open up different from the one he'd originally applied for, but actually a step up in terms of responsibility and potential. They'd received a very strong recommendation on his behalf. Would he be available to come in for an interview? Say tomorrow at 2:00 p.m. Ben said yes. Hung up the phone and stood in his kitchen for a long moment, staring at nothing, trying to figure out if this was really happening or if he'd somehow fallen asleep and was dreaming it all. Then Lily came home from school, dumped her backpack by the door and said, "Dad, what's wrong? You look weird." "I got another interview," Ben said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, halfway between disbelief and something that might have been hope. "At Meridian Hotels tomorrow, at 2:00 p.m. Lily squealed and threw her arms around his waist, and Ben held onto her and thought that just for a moment maybe Rachel was right. Maybe the world wasn't quite as awful as it sometimes seemed. The next 24 hours passed in a state of suspended anticipation. Ben existed in the space between what had been and what might be, unable to fully commit to either possibility. He went through the motions of his daily life, picked up a small HVAC repair job at a residential property, paid what he could toward the electric bill, made Lily dinner from the remaining groceries in their apartment, but his mind was fractured between the present moment and the future that Rachel had dangled in front of him, like a promise he wasn't entirely sure he could trust. He'd been promised opportunities before. He'd been disappointed before. Hope was a commodity he'd learned to ration carefully, measuring it out in small portions so that when it inevitably evaporated, the loss wouldn't completely demolish him. But this was different. Rachel Hayes wasn't making a promise as an anonymous recruiter or a distant employer. She was making a promise as someone whose life he'd saved, as someone whose daughter he'd pulled from a burning vehicle. The transaction was clear and direct. She owed him something, and she was choosing to repay that debt in the form of opportunity. The logic was sound. The reasoning was straightforward. And yet Ben found himself unable to fully relax into the knowledge that this might actually work out. He prepared differently for this interview than he had for the first one. That had been a performance of competence, a construction of professionalism built from studying videos and practicing in front of mirrors. This one was rooted in something more authentic. He knew his qualifications. He'd proven them dozens of times over in the field, fixing systems that others had abandoned as unfixable, managing problems, with the kind of practical knowledge that came from years of hands-on experience. He didn't need to embellish because the truth was actually compelling. He ironed his best shirt again, the one without the stain, and he made sure his boots were clean. He wasn't trying to be someone he wasn't. He was just trying to present the best version of the person he actually was. Lily noticed the change in him. Children were hyper-aware of shifts in their parents' emotional weather, sensitive to the subtle alterations in tone and bearing that preceded change. She was quieter than usual the morning of the interview, more watchful. She asked if he was going to get the job this time, and Ben found himself telling her the truth instead of a comforting lie. He told her that he was going to interview, and that he was qualified for the position, and that he was hopeful. He didn't promise success because he'd learned that promises about the future were dangerous things. But he did communicate through the steadiness of his voice and the absence of the particular desperation that had colored his presentation of the first interview, that something had shifted in the fundamental calculus of possibility. The drive downtown took him along the same route he'd taken before, though the timing was different this time. He was driving in the afternoon, heading toward a 2:00 p.m. appointment with plenty of buffer time built into his schedule. The memory of Route 12 and the accident lingered as he drove, a phantom impression of what had happened in this same geography just weeks before. He thought about Rachel and Harper, about the way Harper's small hand had been pressed against the rear window of the car, about the trickle of blood that had run from her nose. He thought about the choice he'd made in those moments, the calculation that had been made at the cellular level of his being, that certain things mattered more than timing, more than opportunity, more than the particular future that had been waiting for him in that glass and chrome tower downtown. The interview itself went better than he could have anticipated. The facilities manager who conducted it was a man named David Chen, someone in his mid-50s, with the kind of practical knowledge that suggested he'd come up through the same kind of hands-on background that Ben had. They talked for almost an hour, moving through Ben's experience with different HVAC systems, discussing his approach to maintenance scheduling, examining his understanding of regulatory compliance, and emergency repair protocols. David seemed genuinely interested in the details of Ben's work. Asked follow-up questions that indicated he was actually listening, seemed to appreciate the way Ben approached complex mechanical problems with a combination of technical knowledge and creative problem solving. "You've got solid experience," David said as the interview wound down. "The way you talk about systems, the way you think through problems, that's something you can't teach. That comes from time in the field." He stood up and extended his hand, and his grip was firm and genuine. "I think you're exactly what we're looking for. You'll be hearing from us very soon." Very soon. Ben walked out of the building feeling lighter than he had in weeks, almost allowing himself to believe that this might actually work out, that the nightmare of the past month might finally be ending. The interview had gone so well. David had seemed impressed. The position was a step up from what he'd originally applied for: more responsibility, more potential, more of everything that might translate into a future where Lily could have new shoes when her feet grew and books when her class was reading them. He was halfway to his truck when he heard someone call his name. He turned to find a man in an expensive suit striding toward him. Late 40s, silver hair, the kind of confident posture that came from never having to worry about money a day in your life. The man's face was composed into an expression of professional courtesy, but there was something underneath it, something sharp and assessing and not entirely friendly. "Mr. Carter," the man said, extending his hand, "I'm Graham Foster, Director of Human Resources for Meridian Hotels. I was hoping I might have a word with you privately." They ended up in Graham's office on the 14th floor, all glass walls and minimalist furniture, and a view of the city that probably cost more in rent than Ben made in a year. Graham gestured for Ben to sit, and there was something in his expression that made unease prickle along Ben's spine. The kind of unease that came when you were suddenly aware that you didn't understand the full scope of what was happening, that there were layers to this conversation that you weren't equipped to navigate. "I'll be direct, Mr. Carter," Graham said, folding his hands on the desk. "I know why you're here. I know that Rachel Hayes vouched for you, and I know exactly why she felt compelled to do so. I've reviewed the police report from the accident, spoken to the responding officers, confirmed the timeline. You did indeed help Mrs. Hayes and her daughter, and you did indeed miss your original interview as a result." He paused, his eyes sharp and assessing. "So let me lay out the situation for you clearly." Ben waited, saying nothing, because he could hear the shape of where this was going, could sense the pivot point before it arrived. "Rachel Hayes is a major stakeholder in this company," Graham continued. "Her father founded Hayes Property Group, and she holds significant influence despite not being involved in day-to-day operations. When she makes a request, we listen. However," he paused, letting the weight of that single word hang in the air between them, "I am the one who actually runs this hotel chain, Mr. Carter. I hire the people, I set the standards, and I don't appreciate anyone, no matter how well-connected, attempting to circumvent our normal hiring procedures." "I didn't ask her to do this," Ben said, keeping his voice level. "She offered. I didn't solicit it." "I'm aware," Graham said, leaning back in his chair, "which is the only reason we're having this conversation instead of security escorting you out. I've reviewed your qualifications. You're experienced, knowledgeable, and from what I understand, you performed well in your interview today. Under normal circumstances, you'd be a strong candidate for this position. But these aren't normal circumstances, are they?" The question hung in the air, demanding a response that Ben couldn't quite formulate. He understood what Graham was saying, understood the mechanism of what was happening. He was being offered a choice, though the full parameters of that choice hadn't been articulated yet. "What are you saying?" Ben asked. "I'm saying that if I hire you, it will always be because Rachel Hayes made a phone call," Graham said. His voice was calm, controlled, almost reasonable. "Your coworkers will know it. Your supervisors will know it. And every time you make a mistake, every time you're late or mess up or fail to meet expectations, people will assume it's because you're protected, because you have connections that you don't actually deserve to be here. I've seen it happen before. It breeds resentment. It damages team morale. It makes my job harder. Ben's hands curled into fists on his lap. So you're not going to hire me? I didn't say that, Graham said. He pulled out a folder, slid it across the desk with a gesture that was almost casual. I'm offering you a choice. You can accept this position with the understanding that your connection to Rachel Hayes remains strictly confidential. You sign a non-disclosure agreement, promising never to reveal how you came to work here, never to leverage your relationship with the Hayes family for any professional advantage, and never to contact Rachel Hayes while you remain employed at Meridian Hotels. You become just another employee. No special treatment, no exceptions. No one ever finds out that you know her, that you saved her life, that she intervened on your behalf. You stay silent, and the opportunity is yours. Ben stared at the folder like it was a snake that might bite him. Or, he asked. Or, Graham said, and his expression remained unchanged. You walk away right now, and I'll personally ensure you receive a generous severance package. $50,000 cash. Enough to get you through the next few months. Find another position elsewhere. Move on with your life. But you don't work here, and you don't get to leverage the fact that you know Rachel Hayes to advance your career in any way. The words hung in the air between them, and Ben felt the weight of them settle into his chest like something physical and heavy. He was being asked to choose between his dignity and his daughter's future. That was the core of what was happening, stripped of all the professional language and talk of hiring procedures and team morale. Graham Foster had identified the fundamental pressure point of Ben's life and was pressing down on it with calculated precision. You want me to pretend I don't know her, Ben said quietly, to take this job under false pretenses and spend every day looking over my shoulder wondering if someone's going to find out the truth and use it against me. I'm asking you to earn your place like everyone else, Graham said, to prove that Ben Carter, the employee, worth just as much as Ben Carter, the man who saved Rachel Hayes' life. Nobility is admirable, Mr. Carter, truly, but nobility doesn't pay the bills, does it? And I suspect a man in your position, single father mounting debts, limited prospects, can't really afford to turn down either of the options I'm offering you. He was right. That was the worst part. Graham Foster was absolutely right. Ben needed this job or he needed that money. And either way, he needed to swallow his pride and take what was being offered because Lily was at home right now, probably doing her homework at the kitchen table, probably wearing those two small pajamas, probably trying not to think about whether they'd have enough for groceries this week. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on Ben's shoulders like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe. He stood up slowly, carefully, like he was moving through water. He looked at the folder on the desk, at Graham Foster's expectant face, at the city spread out below them through the glass walls. All those people living their lives completely unaware that up here on the 14th floor, a man was being given a choice between his dignity and his daughter's future. It was a choice that had been made for people like him forever, the eternal calculation of those with power over those without. Do what we want or suffer the consequences. Accept the terms or accept poverty. Bend or break. No, Ben said. The word came out steady, certain like it had been formed in some deeper place than rational calculation. No, I'm not signing your NDA and I'm not taking your money. Graham's eyebrows rose slightly. He'd been expecting compliance. He'd been expecting the broken man to stay broken, to accept the terms because there were no other options, because the alternative was unthinkable. You're making a mistake, Graham said. Maybe, Ben said, and he could feel his voice getting stronger as he spoke, as if the act of choosing was restoring something to him that had been slowly eroding. But my daughter is watching me, learning from me, figuring out what kind of person she wants to be based on what kind of person I am. And I can't. I won't teach her that it's okay to be afraid of the truth, that it's acceptable to make yourself small and silent so that powerful men feel comfortable. He turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at Graham Foster's face. Rachel Hayes offered me a second chance because I did the right thing. If I take this position under your conditions, I'd be proving that doing the right thing was stupid, that I should have driven past that accident and shown up on time and climbed over whoever I needed to climb over to get ahead. Is that really the lesson you want me teaching my kid? He walked out of Graham Foster's office without waiting for an answer, walked through the gleaming lobby with its marble floors and gold fixtures, walked out into the afternoon sun, and he didn't let himself think about what he'd just done until he was sitting in his truck with his hands on the steering wheel and his heart pounding in his chest like it was trying to break free. Then he pulled out his phone and called Rachel Hayes. She answered on the second ring, and he could hear the hope in her voice when she asked how the interview went. "I need to tell you something," Ben said, and then he told her everything. The interview with David Chen, the apparent success, Graham Foster pulling him aside the ultimatum, the NDA, the $50,000, the choice he'd been given, and the choice he'd made. When he finished, there was silence on the other end of the line, a long stretch of nothing that made Ben think she might be angry, might think he'd thrown away the opportunities she'd worked to create for him out of some misplaced sense of pride. Then Rachel said very quietly, "That son of a bitch." "I'm sorry," Ben started. "Don't you dare apologize." Rachel cut him off, her voice sharp now, dangerous in a way he hadn't heard before. "Graham had no right to do that, no authority to make those demands. He works for my father, not the other way around, and he seems to have forgotten that. I'm going to call my father right now. This isn't over." "Rachel, you don't have to," Ben said. "I made my choice. I can live with it. Harper asked me yesterday if the nice man was happy now," Rachel said, and her voice carried something that sounded like emotion held carefully in check. "If helping us made his life better, and I told her yes because I wanted to believe it. But if I let Graham Foster get away with this, I'll be teaching my daughter the same lesson you refuse to teach yours. That powerful people can do whatever they want, and the rest of us just have to accept it." "No." She paused. "Give me 24 hours. Don't make any other plans. Can you do that?" "Okay," Ben said, because he didn't know what else to say, because the territory he was in now was beyond his ability to map or navigate. The call came not from Rachel, but from Richard Hayes himself. 20 hours later, at 6:47 p.m., Ben's phone buzzed with an unknown number. He almost didn't answer. The day had been spent in a kind of suspended limbo, going through the motions of existence without really engaging with any of it. He'd picked up Lily from after-school care. He'd made dinner from what remained in their pantry. He'd helped her with her math homework without really absorbing what the numbers meant. He'd been waiting, though he didn't know exactly what he was waiting for. The voice on the other end of the line was gruff and businesslike, with an edge of something that might have been amusement underneath the professional veneer. Richard Hayes didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. The authority in his voice was unmistakable, the casual confidence of a man who'd spent decades reshaping the world according to his specifications. "Mr. Carter, this is Richard Hayes." The words carried the weight of their own significance, the kind of statement that transformed conversations simply by being spoken aloud. "I understand you met my daughter under rather dramatic circumstances." "Yes, sir," Ben said. His mouth had gone dry. He wasn't sure what protocol existed for conversations with billionaires. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say or do in order to navigate this interaction successfully. "And I understand you turned down a job offer from Graham Foster because you didn't like the strings attached." There was a pause on the line, the sound of paper shuffling. "That's not a common decision, Mr. Carter. Most people in your circumstances would have taken the job and kept their mouth shut and counted themselves fortunate to have the opportunity." "I couldn't do it that way," Ben said quietly. Why? The question was direct, cutting through the social niceties that usually mediated conversations like this. "Because my daughter's watching me," Ben said. The words came from someplace deeper than calculation, someplace that understood the fundamental stakes of the conversation. "Because the only thing I have to give her is an example of what it means to be a person who keeps their word, who doesn't sell themselves out for convenience, who understands that some things matter more than money." There was another pause, longer this time. Then Richard Hayes made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else entirely. "Well," he said, "I also understand that you scored a 95 on our technical competency assessment, highest score we've seen in 5 years. Graham was required to administer it after Rachel and I had a rather pointed conversation about hiring practices and the difference between nepotism and gratitude. You passed it anyway, which suggests to me that Rachel's faith in you wasn't misplaced." "I didn't know there was a test," Ben said. He was still trying to process the fact that he'd been given a formal assessment, that there had been mechanisms in place to evaluate him on his actual merits rather than on Graham Foster's personal preferences. Graham didn't tell you, Richard Hayes said. His tone made it clear that he found this omission interesting, revealing. Interesting, well, you passed it anyway. You passed it well. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Carter. I'm going to tell you something about how my company operates. I built it on the principle that competent people deserve opportunities regardless of how they come to our attention. My daughter vouched for you, you proved yourself through formal assessment, and you demonstrated integrity when offered a compromising situation. As far as I'm concerned, that makes you exactly the kind of employee we need. Ben's heart had begun to accelerate. He was starting to understand the shape of what was happening, but he didn't want to assume too much, didn't want to let hope expand into something that might shatter. Sir, I don't understand what The position is yours if you want it, Richard Hayes said, cutting through Ben's attempt at a clarification. Graham Foster has been reassigned to our Las Vegas property effective immediately. The new HR director will be reaching out to you within the hour to discuss terms. No NDAs, no secret conditions, just a standard employment contract. Are you interested, Mr. Carter? Ben closed his eyes, feeling something hot and tight in his chest unwind by a fraction of a degree. The sensation was unfamiliar, almost disorienting. It was the feeling of being caught before you fell of the ground suddenly appearing beneath you when you'd expected only emptiness. Yes, Ben said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant and dreamlike. Yes, sir. I'm very interested. Well, good, Richard Hayes said. Welcome to Meridian Hotels, Mr. Carter. Don't make me regret this. The line went dead. Ben sat there for a long moment, phone still pressed to his ear, trying to process what had just happened. The words seemed to echo in his mind, don't make me regret this. A sentence that was both a benediction and a warning. A statement that carried with it the weight of expectation and the understanding that he had been given something that could be taken away just as easily as it had been granted. But it had been granted. The position was his. The job that had seemed so far out of reach just hours ago was now his to accept or reject, and Richard Hayes clearly expected him to accept it. Then Lily burst through the front door. She'd been in her room doing homework, and she must have heard something in his voice, some shift in his tonal landscape that indicated something significant had shifted. She took one look at his face and said, Dad, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, baby, Ben said, and he pulled her into a hug, held her tight against his chest. Everything's right. Everything's going to be okay. The next morning, the new HR director reached out with all the details. The position was his. The salary was better than he'd expected, better than anything he'd dared to imagine. There were benefits, health insurance that actually covered dental and vision, a retirement plan with company matching paid vacation days that accumulated from the moment he started. There was a start date. There was an orientation. There were the normal administrative apparatus of employment, the official machinery of integration into a large organization. And underneath all of it, there was the fundamental fact that his life had changed. The calculation had shifted. The math that had seemed impossible just days ago suddenly balanced in a way that suggested stability, that implied a future where Lily could have the things that other children had. 6 months later, Ben stood in the maintenance control room of Meridian Hotels reviewing quarterly reports with his team. The preventive maintenance system he'd implemented had reduced emergency repair calls by 40% and saved the company over $200,000. The facilities manager, David Chen, had mentioned casually in a recent conversation that corporate was impressed that there might be opportunities for advancement if Ben was interested. The trajectory was clear. He was proving himself not because of Rachel's intervention or Richard Hayes' directive, but because he was actually good at what he did, because he brought to the work a combination of technical expertise and practical problem solving that created measurable value. The surprise came on a Tuesday afternoon when Rachel Hayes walked into the lobby with Harper. Both of them were dressed for some function or another, some social engagement that required the kind of polished appearance that spoke of resources and access. Harper spotted Ben checking one of the HVAC panels near the elevators, and the little girl's face transformed into an expression of pure recognition and delight. She broke away from her mother and ran over her dress, swishing with the movement, her face bright with the kind of uncomplicated joy that only children seemed capable of maintaining. "It's you," Harper said. "The nice man." Ben smiled, crouching down to her level. She was taller than he remembered, growing at the rate that children did, changing in incremental steps that were only noticeable when you hadn't seen them for a while. "Hey there," he said. "How have you been?" "Good. Mommy says you work here now. Are you happy?" The question was so earnest, so genuinely concerned, that Ben felt something catch in his throat. He thought about the past 6 months, about the way his life had transformed in the space of time that had seemed so impossible to navigate when he was in the middle of it. He thought about the apartment that now had heat in the winter and electricity that didn't flicker. He thought about Lily and her new shoes, about the books she'd gotten for her birthday, about the way she'd stopped making herself smaller in the world. "Yeah," he said softly. "Yeah, I'm happy." Rachel had caught up by then, slightly out of breath from pursuing her daughter. She and Ben exchanged a look that held months of complicated history, gratitude and guilt, and something like friendship. There was a kind of understanding that passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of what had transpired and what it meant for both of them. She'd given him an opportunity, yes, but he'd also given her something in return. He'd given her the knowledge that the right thing to do could sometimes lead to the right outcomes, that her instinct to help had not been misplaced, that the world did occasionally reward integrity rather than punishing it. "Harper's been asking to see you," Rachel said. "I thought maybe we could all get coffee sometime. You and your daughter, me and Harper. No business, no favors, just people who know each other spending time together." Ben thought about it, about Lily and Harper playing together while he and Rachel talked about ordinary things, about the possibility of building something that wasn't based on debt or obligation, but just on mutual respect, and the strange bond formed when lives intersect in moments of crisis. He thought about what it would mean to have friends, to have people in his life who weren't connected to him through the mechanisms of survival and desperation. "I'd like that," he said. Later, after Rachel and Harper had left, Ben's supervisor found him in the mechanical room, double-checking the pressure readings on the boiler system. The supervisor was a woman named Janet, who'd been with Meridian for 8 years and who'd initially been skeptical about Ben until his work had proved his competence beyond question. "Got a minute, Carter?" she asked. "Sure," he said, looking up from the gauge. "What's up?" "Just wanted to let you know that Graham Foster called from Vegas," she said. Her expression was neutral, carefully so, like she was delivering information she'd been holding for a while and was glad to finally be rid of it. "Asked how you were working out." Ben straightened up, wiping his hands on his work pants. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were one of the best hires we'd made in years," Janet said. "That you earned your place here fair and square. That your technical knowledge is solid, your work ethic is exemplary, and that the team respects you." She paused and a small smile appeared on her face. "I told him all of that because it's true, and I wanted him to know that we didn't need his benediction to make you a success." Ben felt something settle in his chest, solid and sure. The validation he'd been seeking wasn't coming from Graham Foster, or from the mechanisms of power that had initially seemed so determinative. It was coming from people who worked alongside him, who understood the reality of his contributions, who recognized competence when they witnessed it. "What did he say?" Ben asked. "Nothing," Janet said. "Just hung up." She clapped him on the shoulder. "Keep up the good work." That night, when Ben tucked Lily into bed, she was wearing new pajamas now, ones that actually fit her properly, ones that didn't have sleeves that ended 3 inches above her wrists. She looked up at him with sleepy eyes and said something that made his throat tighten. "Dad, I'm proud of you." "Yeah," Ben said, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "Why is that?" "Because you're happy," she said. Her voice was drowsy, already drifting towards sleep. "And because you did the right thing even when it was hard." Ben kissed her forehead, held the moment in his mind like something precious that he wanted to preserve. "You know what?" he said quietly. "I'm proud of you too." "I didn't do anything," Lily said, her eyes already closing. "You did everything," Ben said. He sat there in the dark for a while, listening to her breathe, thinking about choices and consequences, and the strange winding path that led from a moment of crisis on a highway to this quiet room, this peaceful child, this life they'd built together. Sometimes doing the right thing cost you everything. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it gave you back more than you'd lost. The trick was having the courage to choose it anyway, even when you couldn't see what waited on the other side.